President Buhari sets the tone for the new year as he asks Nigerians to play their part on this difficult journey to nationhood and greatness. But the opposition PDP is not impressed with the president's pronouncements. And now that we're in 2021, we analyze the fiscal roadmap of the government through the instrument of the budget. How would we spend? And more importantly, how would we fund the 13.588 trillion naira budget? Well, we hear from someone who knows. Hello and welcome. This is Politics Today, the very first edition in the year 2021. I'm Kayode Okikiolu. Happy New Year to you. Glad you made it. Not to worry, it'll be a great year. Well, challenging definitely, but nevertheless, a great year. Well, if you're in Nigeria, you may have woken up to the president's New Year's speech at 7 a.m. today. Now, this is different from what we saw on New Year's Day 2020 when the president wrote a letter titled Nigeria's Decade. The irony of it all is that we were preparing for the big decade then. Little did we know that the year had something different in store for us. But a lot of Nigerians criticized the president for writing a letter instead of a broadcast at that time, which they said would give them the opportunity to see the president's demeanor and know if he really meant his words. Well, it would appear the president listened to them. This year's 17-minute, 32-second-long speech touched on various issues that dominated parts of last year, like the COVID-19 pandemic and the drive for getting vaccines into the country, the NSAS protests and plans to engage Nigerian youth in partnership with the National Assembly. The perceived slow-moving pace of the government also came up, and of course, security, which is arguably the biggest topic last year. And not forgetting the economy and anti-corruption, which are all part of the SEA agenda of this administration. So take a listen to the president.
Some of the key priority areas we will direct our attention and strength to include re-energizing and reorganizing the security apparatus and personnel of the armed forces and the police with a view to enhance their capacity to engage, push back, and dismantle the operations of both internal and external extremists and criminal groups waging war against our communities in some parts of the country. It proves that Nigeria has the internal capacity to decisively deal with terror attacks on our citizens. However, we recognize that we rapidly have to move to a more proactive and preemptive posture to ensure that these sorts of traumatic incidents do not become a norm. Our administration is fully aware of the responsibility we have to protect the lives and property of all Nigerians, and we will not relent in learning and adapting to changing threats to our national security and civic well-being.
Well, the opposition People's Democratic Party doesn't seem impressed by the president's demeanor, but especially with the content of the New Year message. In fact, the party calls it empty and directionless. The National Publicity Secretary of the party, Kola Ologbondiyan, says, and I quote, the PDP laments as appalling that on New Year's Day, all that President Buhari could offer a troubled and frustrated nation was a regurgitated script full of lame excuses and empty promises that address nothing. As a president, President Buhari has not demonstrated the capacity to play his own part, as he claimed, having failed to find solution for the security and economic challenges that pervade our nation under his incompetent and lethargic watch. The party goes on to say the myriads of lame excuses in Mr. President's address again underlines our national misfortune of a weak leadership that is unable to resolutely confront and vanquish bandits, terrorists, kidnappers, and vandals who are now holding our nation hostage, ravaging our communities, kidnapping and beheading our compatriots without restraint. Well, 365 days in this year, 2020. Well, we're almost done with the first day. So the government at all arms and tiers now has 364 days to get to work. Incidentally, tonight, we take a look at a document that will be vital to the success of this government this year, which is the budget. The president assented to it yesterday, just in time for the new year, exactly 10 days after it was passed by the National Assembly. So tonight on the program, we speak with a man who should know the budget like the back of his hands, and we find out just how much this budget of economic recovery and resilience will change the reality of Nigerians. Well, as you can see, we're being joined by the DG Budget Office of the Federation, Mr. Ben Kabweze. It's great to have you on the program, and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to you as well as everyone else listening.
Well, seeing that we have followed by the way, thank you for that. Seeing that we have followed the budget from its inception to when it was laid before the National Assembly, the whole appropriation process, it was passed, now assented to by the president. So I think it's only fair to know where the budget is right now. So the president has assented the bill into law. So where is it headed now? What happens from here?
Well, what happens from here is implementation. But for the fact that today is a holiday, implementation should commence, right away. So technically from Monday, MDAs can begin to implement their 2021 budget. And that's the beauty of getting the budget passed, on time.
All right. So just before we take a look at this 2021 budget, more critically, let's talk about a 2020 budget, because this will help us understand what to expect from this 2021 budget. And I'm talking about implementation. So you've tried to release the budget implementation report, that's a BIR, for the first quarter, the second quarter, half year 2020. But we don't have anything for the third quarter and, of course, the fourth quarter. So help us understand, how well did the 2020 budget do?
Well, first of all, to say that we had released the third quarter budget implementation report, but the fourth quarter, of course, we only ended yesterday. We haven't, put out that, report, but we have a performance, implementation status up to end of November. We normally just put out in the public the quarterly performance. But in summary, and this is noteworthy, because when the budget for 10.8 trillion naira was passed, I think there were a lot of people who were skeptical about the ability of the government to implement the budget. But I'm pleased to say that, for 2020, we've recorded the highest budget performance that I certainly know of since I was old enough to start tracking Nigeria's federal budget performance. And we've got an overall performance of 97% of that budget, which means that, we planned to spend 10.8 trillion naira, and we spent 10.5 trillion naira. And usually, it's everyone knows that we usually about 100% on the recurrent portion of our budget, and the challenge has always been with the the capital side of the budget. But for 2020, we recorded 89.1% performance of the capital budget, and an overall combined performance of 97%. We will be putting these details out shortly. I think the date tentatively set at January 12, when the Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning will, make the usual presentation on the 2020 budget performance, as well as provide details of the budget that the president just assented to.
Now, for the avoidance of doubt, when you talk about the BIR for the third quarter, where can Nigerians find this? Because a look on your website shows you have the one for the first quarter, the one for the second quarter, half year, but the one for the third quarter is not seen. So where can Nigerians find this, just so they can always refer to it?
Well, first of all, there is what is called the BIR, which is a budget implementation report, which includes an inspection, a physical inspection report on, a sample of projects. That's what is called the budget implementation report. But there is a budget performance report, which is just a financial report. You will find that on the website of the budget office. If you look for, third quarter budget performance report. The BIR, the budget implementation report for third quarter, is still being prepared because COVID-19 created restrictions about how people could travel and for the budget monitoring and inspection processes. But so that was only for the third quarter, only just completed a few weeks back.
Right. I mean, it's good you cleared the air on that. But let's talk about an issue, because one major thing that jumps out every time this budget is discussed is the obvious deficit, this time of about 5.7 trillion naira. And for a lot of economists, they'd rather have maybe a balanced budget or a surplus even. So the question is this deliberate deficit financing? Because some say this is what you do when you're going through difficult times, or this is basically out of government's hands. What exactly is the plan here, really?
Well, for many years now, Nigeria has been operating a deficit budget. Some countries have laws about balancing their budgets. We don't. Neither do we have any requirement for, a surplus, budget. So it's basically at the discretion of the government of the day and based on the exigencies of the day. And for several years now, possibly, decades, Nigeria has been running a deficit budget. And the deficit budget in and of itself is not bad, especially when you have, such huge developmental challenges as we have. And then, of course, in times of, difficulty, the economics says to us that the way to get out of it is to adopt counter-cyclical, fiscal measures, which means that at such times you're keeping spending high and spending what you haven't really earned. And unfortunately, we found ourselves in that situation for a while. But of course, fiscal deficits must be kept within sustainable limits. And that's why in 2007, the legislature, in its wisdom, passed the 2000, well, it wasn't the legislature, let's say government, because it was really an executive field, the first place. The 2007 Fiscal Responsibility Act, which set a ceiling of 3% on the annual fiscal deficit. 3%
I didn't catch that.
3% of the deficit as the ceiling of the annual deficit. But even that legislation allowed for circumstances where that could be exceeded. We have exceeded that threshold in the last 2 years because those circumstances have been thought to be present.
Right.
The act says that if, in the opinion of the president, the country faces some existential risk, then it can't exceed that.
I'd like to pause you for a moment. I mean, it's interesting to talk about that deficit because it might also imply government inefficiency or wasteful spending. And this is something we'll come to when we return from this break, especially in the area of financing this budget. So please join us again. Welcome back to the program. Let's get back to our conversation. But a bit of background here. Nigeria is currently in a recession. Well, there are predictions that Nigeria will exit that recession in the coming months, but as it stands, we are in a recession. That's on the one hand. Also, you have rising unemployment. It's at 27.1% from the 23% we had previously. Not to talk about inflation. Inflation is at 14.8%, rising for 15 consecutive months. There's a value of the naira which leaves much to be desired, dwindling oil revenue, and so much more, which is why this budget is important. As you can see right there, the deficit is 5.7 trillion naira, and it talks about the revenue, which actually dropped compared to what we had last year. The total, of course, increased from 10.8 trillion naira last year to 13.588, or if you may, 59 trillion naira. And there's a breakdown really for you to see statutory transfers. By the way, what was presented at the National Assembly and what was passed by the National Assembly and eventually assented to by the President. So this just gives you a picture really of our spending plan for the year 2021. So let's rejoin the Director General of the Budget Office of the Federation, Mr. Ben Kaboise, as he walks us through this whole process. And thank you for staying with us. Now, we're going to talk about raising revenue because that's the big one. Now, this tells us how we're going to spend. There's also the big talk about how we'll raise what we'll spend. So the question is there any creativity different from what we have seen in previous budgets in terms of raising revenue other than getting loans and the usual? What is the creativity here that you bring on board?
Well, you see, that's part of the difficulty. When you are in a recession, that's usually not the time for government to get aggressive with raising revenues. And so you will see that, the Finance Act, which, by the way, was also Finance Act 2020, which, by the way, was also assented to by Mr. President yesterday. One of the underlying cardinal principles of that was no new taxes, because, as I said, that's the principle when this Finance Act was also counter-cyclical in its overall approach. You saw government at a time when we are challenged for revenues. You would think that government's approach would be to grab. You saw government instead putting out lots of incentives to business to basically, let business keep growing and therefore be able to to employ people and whatever, while government itself runs up those deficits. And then we return to growth, as we return to recovery and subsequently growth, then government can again become a bit more aggressive in terms of taxation. However, there is going to be a strong focus on efficiency of tax administration. So the fact that new taxes are not being introduced, the fact that VAT isn't being increased beyond the 7.5% of the last, does not mean that the tax administrators are not going to get tougher on the guys who evade taxes. So the focus is going to be on administration. And in terms of, you asked the question about creativity, that really is going to come mainly from the increased deployment of technology in tax administration.
Well, it will sound like a copy and paste really from that Keynesian theory of spending, budget deficit, which we talked about, which is why I asked about the creativity. But if you say technology is that edge, then Well, I guess that's different because there was no technology at that time. But quickly, let me touch on this because the president also talked about it in his New Year's message, the COVID-19 vaccine purchase and eventual distribution. How does this budget, well, if it does, how does it sort that problem?
This budget, as currently passed, makes no specific provisions for COVID-19 vaccines. That is a matter currently under discussion, interministerial group, including ourselves, and indeed involving, the legislature. We are looking at it. However, I mean, the budget includes, in terms of provisions for vaccines on the outside, if you stretch all of the provisions in the budget that can be deployed for vaccines, then we have over 80 billion naira in the current budget. That really, but that's vaccines, in general for COVID-19, not specifically. The Ministry of Health has come up with a first cut, estimate about what it will cost to, vaccinate Nigerians over the next 2 years, with a target to reach a 70%, coverage, which is a threshold, a reckon at which we'll achieve herd immunity. But there are lots of things to talk about, that before really arriving at. And what we've agreed is that when we get to a mutually acceptable landing point, then that may go as a supplementary budget. But the point is, again, the global donor community is committing to, provide vaccination for up to 20% of Nigerian population, okay, on a grant basis. And so what the health community is looking at is for government to raise funding for the additional 50%. And so those are the discussions ongoing.
Right. Well, it's good you cleared the air because, the CDC has spoken about, getting some financing from Afreximbank and possibly the World Bank. And a lot of Nigerians will be wondering, I hope we have sorted this out. But if it will come through a supplementary budget, then I guess we'll be waiting to see how that works. But back to the revenue generation side, because looking at the that implementation report on your website for the second quarter, we see that total info for that period, second quarter, was 1.032 billion, or rather trillion naira. And it's lower really than what you projected. So what happens if our projections really does not become reality? How do we find our way around it?
Basically, if you fail to meet your revenue projections, you have the following options. Option one is that you simply cut your spending back to the limit of the revenues that you were able to generate. Option two is that you increase your deficit, amount of deficit more. And it's important to understand that when it comes to the budget, you have discretionary expenditures and you have non-discretionary expenditures. And the truth is, if your actual revenues fall below your non-discretionary expenditure level, you may have to then exceed your planned, deficit. So that's the reality. And in our own case, that was the fact.
Right. So, well, like I said earlier on, we have about 364 days to really get to work, and we wish you the very best in this whole process. We've been speaking with the DG Budget Office of the Federation, Mr. Ben Akabweze, on the budget.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure, and Happy New Year once again.
I wish you the same once again. So that's our program for tonight. It's the beginning of a new year, a great year, definitely. So thank you for joining us, and have a great year.